The massage oil still stains his fingers even now, months later, though he scrubs them raw every morning. Robert Matthews thought he knew danger when he saw it. 27 years as a detective in Chicago had taught him to read people, to spot the warning signs before trouble found him. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what happened in that dimly lit room on Walking Street in Pattaya, where the scent of jasmine masked something far more sinister. The nightmare began on a Tuesday in March when the tropical heat hung thick in the air like a suffocating blanket. Robert had come to Thailand seeking nothing more than escape from the ghost of his late wife Sarah, whose memory haunted every corner of their empty suburban home. 3 years had passed since cancer took her, and the retirement that was supposed to be their golden adventure together had become a prison of loneliness and regret. At 54, Robert found himself in a foreign country where everything felt simultaneously alien and oddly comforting. The chaos of Bangkok had given way to the beach town atmosphere of Pattaya, where aging Western men walked hand in hand with young Thai women, and nobody asked questions about your past or your pain. He told himself he was just another tourist seeking sun and anonymity, but the truth was darker. He was a broken man running from himself, carrying credit cards and desperation in equal measure. The massage parlour advertised traditional Thai healing on a neon sign that flickered against the humid night. Through the glass window he could see rows of uniformed women sitting patiently, their hands folded, their smiles practiced but somehow still inviting. Robert had walked past this place a dozen times during his 3 weeks in Pattaya, always telling himself he was just exploring the neighbourhood, just taking in the local culture. But tonight felt different. Tonight the loneliness was a physical ache in his chest, and the bourbon he'd consumed at the hotel bar had dulled his usually sharp instincts. If you're watching this story and recognizing the signs of a man about to make a terrible mistake, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share real stories of people who learned hard lessons so others don't have to repeat them. The woman who greeted him at the door introduced herself as Mama-san, a thick-set Thai woman in her 50s with kind eyes that seemed to see right through his tourist facade. She spoke broken English peppered with knowing nods, and when she asked what kind of massage he wanted, something in her tone suggested she understood exactly what kind of healing he was seeking. Not the physical kind, but the kind that comes from human connection, from feeling wanted and needed again after years of being invisible in his own life. The interior was like stepping into another world. Soft lighting cast everything in warm amber tones, while traditional Thai music played softly from hidden speakers. The air was thick with incense and something else, something that made his pulse quicken with anticipation and apprehension. This wasn't just a massage parlour, he realised. This was a place where fantasies were bought and sold, where lonely men came to pretend they were still desirable, still capable of inspiring passion in a beautiful woman. As Mama-san led him through a corridor lined with rooms, each behind a curtain that offered the illusion of privacy, Robert caught glimpses of other men in various states of undress, their faces bearing the same mixture of guilt and desperate hope that he felt burning in his own chest. He was no different from them, he realised with a mixture of shame and relief. He was just another middle-aged American who had come to Thailand to buy what he couldn't find at home anymore. The room she showed him to was small but clean, with a massage table covered in fresh linens and a small altar in the corner where incense burned before a golden Buddha statue. The walls were thin enough that he could hear muffled conversations and soft music from the adjacent rooms, creating an atmosphere of intimate anonymity that felt both exciting and somehow ominous. Robert tried to push down the voice in his head, that sounded suspiciously like Sarah's, warning him that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Robert's story didn't begin in that massage parlour, though that's where it would end. It started 3 months earlier in a suburb of Chicago, in a house that had become a mausoleum to a marriage that death had made perfect in memory, but unbearable in absence. Every morning he woke up reaching for Sarah's warm body and finding only cold sheets. Every evening he set the table for 2 out of habit, then stared at the empty chair where she used to critique his cooking and plan their retirement adventures. Sarah had always been the dreamer in their relationship. While Robert dealt with the gritty reality of police work, chasing down criminals and filling out paperwork in precinct houses that smelled of coffee and disappointment, Sarah planned their future travels. She had a corkboard covered with pictures of exotic destinations, each one marked with a little flag and a note about what they would do there. Thailand was always at the top of her list, with its golden temples and pristine beaches, its promise of adventure in their golden years. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, Robert found himself staring at that corkboard for hours. The pictures of Thailand seemed to mock him with their bright colours and promises of paradise. How could he go to those places without her? How could he fulfill their shared dreams when half of the dreaming team was gone forever? But the alternative was staying in a house where every room whispered her name, where every familiar object carried the weight of memory. The decision to retire early came suddenly, on a grey Tuesday in December, when he was supposed to be investigating a domestic violence case, but found himself sitting in his patrol car, crying into his hands like a child. 27 years of service had earned him a decent pension, and Sarah's life insurance had left him financially secure. He had enough money to disappear for a while, to see if travel could cure what grief counselling and prescription antidepressants had failed to touch. The booking process felt like betrayal at first. Every click of the mouse as he reserved flights and hotels felt like he was abandoning Sarah's memory, like he was moving forward without her permission. But Robert had learned something in his years as a detective. Sometimes the only way to solve a case was to follow the evidence, even when it led you places you didn't want to go. The evidence in his case was clear. He was dying slowly in that house, suffocating on memories and might-have-beens. Thailand had been Sarah's idea, but now it became his escape route. He told himself he was honouring her memory by visiting the places she'd dreamed of seeing. He convinced himself that she would want him to experience the adventures they'd planned together, even if he had to experience them alone. But deep down, Robert knew the truth. He wasn't going to Thailand to remember Sarah. He was going to forget her, at least for a while, to see if he could remember who he was before grief had hollowed him out. The flight to Bangkok was his first time out of the United States in over a decade. As the plane lifted off from O'Hare, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the terrifying thrill of uncertainty. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, he had no idea what came next. No treatment schedules to follow, no doctor's appointments to attend, no insurance forms to fill out. Just him and 16 hours of flight time to think about what he was really looking for in a country halfway around the world. Bangkok had overwhelmed him immediately. The heat, the noise, the sheer human chaos of 8 million people living and working and dreaming in a space that seemed too small to contain all that energy. But it was exactly what he needed. A place so foreign and overwhelming that it demanded his full attention, leaving no room for the ghosts that had haunted him back home. For the first time in months, Robert found himself thinking about something other than cancer and loss. But Bangkok was just the beginning. After a week of temples and street food and the kind of exhausting sightseeing that left him too tired to think, Robert had moved on to Pattaya. The beach town promised a different kind of experience, something more relaxed, more conducive to the kind of healing he wasn't sure he was ready to admit he needed. He rented a small apartment near the beach, telling himself he was just extending his vacation, just giving himself time to decompress before returning to real life. The truth was more complicated. Pattaya was full of men like him, Western men of a certain age who had come to Thailand carrying invisible wounds. Some were running from divorce, others from career failures or health scares, or simply the creeping awareness that their best years were behind them. They gathered in the same bars, told the same stories, and pretended they were just tourists having an adventure. But Robert recognized the look in their eyes because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. The desperate hope that geography could cure what time and loss had broken. Her name was Naran, which he told him meant eternal in Thai, and from the moment she walked into that massage room, Robert felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening in a house that had been locked up for too long. She was perhaps 35, with shoulder-length black hair that caught the amber light like silk, and when she smiled at him, it reached her eyes in a way that seemed impossible in a place where smiles were bought and sold. Niran moved with a grace that spoke of classical training, her hands sure and gentle as she guided him through the ritual of preparing for the massage. She spoke English with an accent that made even ordinary words sound like poetry, and when she asked about his travels, her interest seemed genuine rather than professional. As Robert lay face down on the massage table, feeling her skilled fingers work the tension from muscles that had been knotted with grief for months, he found himself telling her things he hadn't spoken aloud since Sarah's death. He told her about the empty house in Chicago, about the way morning coffee tasted wrong when you only made one cup, about the challenge of learning to cook for one person after decades of family meals. Niran listened without judgment, her hands never pausing in their rhythmic pressure against his back and shoulders. When he mentioned Sarah's name for the first time in months without feeling like he was going to choke on it, Niran simply said that love like that never really ends, it just changes form. The massage session was supposed to last 1 hour, but somehow it stretched into 2, then 3. Other customers came and went, their voices filtering through the thin walls, but Niran seemed content to stay with Robert, working on muscles that hadn't been touched with kindness in longer than he cared to remember. When she finally indicated that their time was over, Robert felt a panic he hadn't experienced since Sarah's final days in the hospital, the fear of being alone again. As he dressed, Niran lingered in the room, straightening linens that didn't need straightening, arranging oil bottles that were already perfectly organised. Finally, she turned to him with something that looked almost like shyness and asked if he planned to stay in Pattaya long. When Robert mentioned he had no firm plans, that his retirement was open-ended, something flickered in her eyes that might have been relief or calculation. It was impossible to tell which, and in that moment, Robert realised he didn't care. They made plans to meet the next evening for dinner, not at one of the tourist restaurants along Beach Road, but at a small place in the hills above the city that Niran said served the best somtam in the province. Robert spent the entire next day in a state of nervous energy he hadn't felt since his first date with Sarah 40 years earlier. He bought new clothes, got his hair cut, and spent an embarrassing amount of time practicing conversation topics in his hotel room mirror. The restaurant was everything Niran had promised, authentic, intimate, and completely empty of other Western tourists. She arrived wearing a traditional Thai dress that made her look like something from a travel poster, and for the first time since landing in Thailand, Robert felt like he was experiencing something real rather than performing the role of tourist. They talked for hours over plates of spicy papaya salad and grilled fish, sharing stories about their respective countries and cultures. Naran told him about growing up in a village north of Bangkok, about working her way through university on scholarships and determination, about her dreams of opening her own spa someday. She spoke about her family with the kind of respect and devotion that Robert remembered from his own childhood, before divorce and geographic mobility had scattered American families to the winds. There was something refreshing about her focus on family, her assumption that caring for aging parents and contributing to the household was simply what adults did. As the evening wore on, Robert found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't in years. Naran had a gift for asking questions that drew him out without making him feel interrogated, and she listened to his answers with the kind of attention that made him feel interesting again, worth knowing. When he mentioned his police career, she seemed genuinely fascinated by the stories he told, though she tactfully avoided asking about the more violent or traumatic cases that still haunted his dreams. By the time they said goodnight, Robert was already planning their next meeting. Naran suggested they could explore some of the temples outside the city, places where tourists rarely went but which offered insight into the real Thailand. As she spoke about hidden waterfalls and mountain villages, Robert felt something he'd thought was dead forever stirring in his chest. The desire to share new experiences with someone who mattered, to build memories with a person who seemed to understand him in ways he'd almost forgotten were possible. Walking back to his hotel that night, Robert caught himself humming for the first time since Sarah's funeral. The streets of Pattaya looked different somehow, less seedy and more exotic, as if Naran's presence had changed his lens for seeing this strange place. He fell asleep that night thinking about her laugh, about the way she'd corrected his pronunciation of Thai words with gentle patience, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a dream Robert didn't want to wake up from. He and Naran fell into an easy rhythm that felt natural despite its improbability. Breakfast together at a small cafe near her apartment, lazy afternoons exploring temples and markets, dinners at restaurants where she taught him to navigate menus written entirely in Thai script. For the first time since Sarah's death, Robert felt like he was living rather than just surviving. Naran seemed to take genuine pleasure in showing him her country through local eyes. She took him to a floating market 2 hours outside Pattaya, where vendors sold fruits he'd never seen before from boats painted in colours that hurt to look at in the morning sun. She taught him to bargain with motorcycle taxi drivers, to order street food without pointing like a helpless tourist, to show proper respect when entering temples. Under her guidance, Thailand began to feel less like a foreign country and more like a place where he might actually belong. But it was the quiet moments that really sealed his fate. The way Naran would unconsciously reach for his hand while walking through crowded markets, her small fingers fitting perfectly between his. The way she'd listen with complete attention when he told stories about his police work, asking intelligent questions that showed she understood the weight of what he'd seen and done. The way she'd grown quiet and thoughtful when he spoke about Sarah, not with jealousy, but with something that looked like compassion for a pain she couldn't fully understand, but respected nonetheless. Robert found himself doing things he hadn't done in years. Buying flowers just because they reminded him of her, staying up late talking about everything and nothing, feeling his phone buzz with anticipation rather than dread when text messages arrived. Naran had a way of making even ordinary activities feel special, like when she taught him to make pad thai in her tiny kitchen, laughing at his clumsy attempts to manage the wok while trying not to set anything on fire. The physical relationship developed slowly, with a tenderness that surprised Robert. He'd expected something transactional based on his preconceptions about Thai massage parlours, but what evolved between them felt genuine, almost innocent. Niran seemed content with hand-holding and gentle kisses, and when intimacy finally did happen, it was initiated by her and felt like a gift rather than a service. For the first time in years, Robert felt desired for who he was rather than what he could provide. But even in paradise, there were moments that made his detective instincts twitch. The way Naran sometimes fell silent when her phone rang, stepping away to take calls in rapid Thai that sounded urgent and somehow strained. The way she deflected certain questions about her family, changing the subject when he asked about visiting her home village or meeting her relatives. The way she sometimes seemed to be calculating something behind her eyes, though she always covered it quickly with a smile. There were financial moments that felt slightly off balance too. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things. When they went shopping together, Naran would admire items she couldn't afford, and Robert found himself naturally offering to buy them for her. A silk scarf here, a piece of jewellery there, nothing that would strain his retirement budget, but enough to establish a pattern. She never asked directly, but her pleasure when he bought her gifts was so genuine that Robert found himself looking for reasons to surprise her. Then there was the family emergency. 3 weeks into their relationship, Naran received a tearful phone call from her sister. Their mother had been hospitalised, she explained, and the family needed money for treatment that wasn't covered by Thailand's basic healthcare system. The amount she mentioned, roughly equivalent to $1,500, was significant but not impossible for Robert's budget. When Naran mentioned it with obvious reluctance, apologising for even bringing up financial matters, Robert's protective instincts kicked in immediately. The money transfer was easy enough to arrange, and Naran's gratitude was overwhelming. She cried when he handed her the cash, telling him that no one outside her family had ever shown such kindness to her, that she didn't know how she would ever repay him. Robert brushed off her concerns, telling her that people who cared about each other helped when they could. It felt good to be needed again, to be someone's hero rather than just another grieving widower stumbling through his remaining years. But that night, lying awake in his hotel room while Naran stayed at the hospital with her mother, Robert felt a familiar unease creeping into his chest. It was the same instinct that had kept him alive during 27 years of police work, the nagging sense that something in the story didn't quite add up. He couldn't put his finger on what bothered him exactly, but something about the timing of the emergency, the specific amount needed, and the way Naran had presented the situation felt almost too perfect, too calculated to be completely spontaneous. Robert tried to dismiss his suspicions as the paranoid thinking of a career cop who'd seen too much deception to trust easily. After all, medical emergencies happen to real people, and the emotional distress Naran had shown seemed completely genuine. Perhaps his years of dealing with criminals had made him too cynical to accept that someone might actually care about him without ulterior motives. Maybe some gifts didn't come with strings attached, even in a place like Pattaya where everything seemed to have a price. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks was so gradual, so subtly orchestrated, that Robert didn't recognise it as manipulation until it was far too late. What started as a rescue mission to help Naran's family became a series of increasingly complex financial entanglements, each presented as a temporary emergency that would surely be the last time she'd ever need to ask for help. Naran's mother's condition, initially described as a simple hospitalisation, evolved into a chronic illness requiring expensive ongoing treatment. Then her younger brother needed money for university fees, and her father's small farm was threatened by debts that would destroy the family's livelihood if not addressed immediately. Each crisis felt legitimate and urgent, accompanied by tearful phone calls from family members and official-looking documents that Robert couldn't read but that seemed to support Naran's increasingly desperate requests for assistance. What made it impossible to refuse was the way Naran presented each request with obvious reluctance and shame. She would work herself up to asking for days, becoming quiet and withdrawn until Robert finally coaxed the problem out of her. She would cry when accepting his help, promising repeatedly that she would pay him back as soon as possible, that she had never been in such a position before, that she understood if he couldn't help any more. Her distress seemed so genuine that Robert found himself reassuring her even as his savings account steadily drained. Between the financial crises, their relationship deepened in ways that made Robert feel more alive than he had in years. Naran had moved most of her belongings into his hotel room, transforming it from a sterile tourist accommodation into something that felt almost like home. She cooked for him, massaged away the knots in his shoulders left over from decades of police stress, and listened to his stories with the kind of rapt attention that made him feel like his experiences mattered, like his life had been worth living. The physical intimacy between them had evolved into something Robert had never experienced, even in his marriage to Sarah. Where Sarah had been comfortable but predictable, Naran brought an element of adventure and spontaneity that made him feel decades younger. She seemed genuinely passionate about him, not just tolerant of his middle-aged body, but actively attracted to him in ways that made him stand straighter, dress better, and start thinking about his future with optimism rather than resignation. More importantly, Naran made him feel needed in ways that went beyond financial support. She relied on him to navigate interactions with government bureaucrats who didn't take single women seriously, to accompany her to business meetings where his Western presence lent credibility to her aspirations, to provide emotional support during the ongoing family crises that seemed to dominate their lives. For the first time since retiring, Robert felt like his skills and experience were valuable, like he was contributing something meaningful to someone else's life. The emotional dependence was mutual and intensifying. Robert found himself unable to imagine returning to Chicago, to the empty house and the ghost of his former life. He extended his visa, then applied for a longer-term tourist permit that would allow him to stay in Thailand for up to 6 months at a time. When Naran suggested they look for an apartment together, something more permanent than his hotel room, Robert agreed immediately, swept up in the fantasy that they were building a life together. The apartment they found was in a new development popular with expat retirees, close enough to the beach for morning walks but far enough from the bar district to feel respectable. The lease required a substantial deposit and 6 months' rent in advance, nearly $10,000 that Robert paid without hesitation. Seeing Naran's joy as she planned how to decorate their shared space, watching her measure windows for curtains and discuss furniture placement with the enthusiasm of a new bride, Robert felt like he was finally living the retirement adventure he and Sarah had planned, just with a different partner. But the requests for money were becoming larger and more frequent. Naran's family seemed to lurch from one financial catastrophe to another with suspicious regularity. The amounts needed grew from hundreds to thousands of dollars, always presented as one-time emergencies that would solve the underlying problems once and for all. Robert found himself withdrawing money from his retirement accounts, taking cash advances on credit cards, and making international wire transfers with increasing frequency. When Naran suggested that he could make their financial arrangement more efficient by adding her name to his Thai bank account, Robert hesitated for the first time. Something about the request triggered his detective instincts, even though Naran presented it in purely practical terms. It would make it easier for her to handle expenses while he was back in Chicago settling his affairs, she explained. She could manage the apartment rent and utilities without having to ask him for money constantly, which would be more dignified for both of them. The hesitation lasted only a few hours. That evening, as Naran massaged his feet while planning their upcoming trip to visit her family village, Robert convinced himself that joint finances were a natural step for people building a life together. After all, he had shared accounts with Sarah for over 2 decades without any problems. If he was serious about making a future with Naran, and he increasingly believed he was, then trust had to be part of the foundation. You know, if you're watching this and thinking about someone in your life who might be in a similar situation, leave a comment below. Have you ever seen a friend or family member get caught up in something like this? Your stories help others recognize the warning signs before it's too late. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more real stories about people who learn difficult lessons the hard way. Adding Naran's name to his accounts felt like a commitment ceremony, a declaration that he was ready to fully integrate their lives. The bank paperwork was handled efficiently, with Naran translating documents and explaining Thai banking procedures with the competence of someone who understood financial systems. As they walked out of the bank together, Robert felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that reminded him of major life decisions from his youth: buying his first house, proposing to Sarah, accepting his first detective assignment. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, though he had no idea how quickly that chapter would turn into a nightmare. The unravelling began on a humid Thursday morning when Robert's credit card was declined at a coffee shop near their apartment. The card had a substantial limit, one he'd never come close to reaching, so his first assumption was a banking error. But when he called the customer service number, the representative informed him that the card was maxed out due to a series of large cash advances that had been taken over the past 2 weeks. Robert felt his stomach drop as he listened to the transaction details. Withdrawals in amounts of $3,000 and $5,000, all taken from ATMs in Bangkok, while he and Naran had been in Pattaya. When he mentioned this to the representative, she politely explained that someone with authorized access to his account could have made the withdrawals using his PIN number. The timing of Robert's realization was perfect. Naran was in Bangkok that very day, supposedly visiting her hospitalized mother. The drive to Bangkok felt endless, even though Robert had made the journey dozens of times over the past few months. His hands shook on the steering wheel as pieces of a puzzle he'd refused to see began clicking into place. The family emergencies that always seemed to require exact amounts of money, the way Naran deflected questions about meeting her relatives, the suspicious timing of crises that coincided with Robert's access to new funds. His detective mind, dormant for months under the influence of loneliness and hope, began analysing evidence he'd been willfully ignoring. The hospital where Naran claimed her mother was staying had no record of any patient by that name. Robert tried multiple variations of the surname Naran had given him, but the admissions desk insisted that no one matching the description had been treated there in the past 6 months. When he showed them Naran's photograph, the receptionist recognised her immediately. She had been there the previous day, but not as a visitor. She had been with a group of young women who were visiting various patients, part of what the hospital staff assumed was some kind of social work program. Robert's hands were trembling as he called Naran's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Her cheerful message, recorded in the early days of their relationship, sounded like mockery now. "Hi, you've reached Naran. I can't answer right now, but leave a message and I'll call you back soon. Have a beautiful day." The casual cruelty of it, the way she'd used his language of endearment in her recording, made Robert feel physically sick. The next stop was the address Naran had given him for her family home, a modest neighbourhood in the outskirts of Bangkok where she claimed her parents lived. The house existed, but the elderly woman who answered the door had never heard of anyone named Naran. She spoke enough English to understand Robert's questions and seemed genuinely concerned about his obvious distress. Through broken English and gestures, she explained that the house had been in her family for 30 years and no young woman matching Naran's description had ever lived there. Reality hit Robert like a physical blow. Everything was a lie. The family emergencies, the hospitalised mother, the struggling relatives, probably even her name. The woman he'd fallen in love with, the person he'd trusted with his finances and his future, was a complete fabrication. He sat in his rental car outside the house where Naran had never lived, staring at his phone, trying to process the magnitude of his delusion. The banking app on his phone confirmed his worst fears. His accounts had been systematically drained over the past month, with transfers and withdrawals totaling nearly $60,000. The pattern was methodical and professional, amounts large enough to be significant, but small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Someone had studied his financial habits, learned his banking patterns, and executed a careful plan to extract maximum value without raising immediate suspicion. When Robert finally reached the massage parlour where he'd first met Naran, the mama-son pretended not to recognise him. But when he showed her Naran's photograph and mentioned the money that had been stolen, her expression changed. In halting English mixed with Thai, she explained that the woman in the photo was not named Naran. Her working name was different every few months, depending on what identity served her purposes best. She specialised in older Western men, particularly those who seemed lonely or recently divorced. The mama-san seemed almost sympathetic as she explained the operation. Naran, or whatever her real name was, worked with a network of people who provided false documents, fake family emergencies, and elaborate backstories designed to separate vulnerable tourists from their money. The massage parlour was just the initial contact point. Once a target was identified and assessed, the real work began, building an emotional connection strong enough to overcome common sense and financial caution. Robert learned that he wasn't Naran's first victim or even her most recent. The mama-san showed him photographs of other Western men, all middle-aged, all with the same expression of confused hope that Robert recognised from his own recent pictures. Some had lost smaller amounts, a few $1,000s before becoming suspicious. Others had been completely cleaned out, their retirement savings and home equity transferred to accounts that disappeared as quickly as the women who'd convinced them to make the transfers. The most devastating revelation came when the mama-san explained that everything about their relationship had been calculated and performed. The way Naran had seemed to genuinely care about his stories, the physical intimacy that had felt so authentic, even her apparent reluctance to ask for money, it was all part of a script refined through dozens of previous victims. She was an actress, and Robert had been her unwitting co-star in a drama designed to separate him from everything he'd worked his entire life to build. As Robert drove back to Pattaya that night, the city lights blurring through tears he was too proud to acknowledge, he realised that the woman he'd fallen in love with had never existed at all. Niran was a carefully constructed fantasy, designed to exploit his specific vulnerabilities and desires. The real person behind the performance was a stranger who had studied him like a mark, learned his weaknesses, and executed a plan that had worked flawlessly until the very end. Robert's first instinct was to go to the police, to treat this like any other crime he'd investigated during his career. But as he sat in the Pattaya police station the next morning, trying to explain the situation to an officer who spoke limited English, the full humiliation of his situation began to sink in. This wasn't a case of simple theft or fraud. This was a crime that required him to admit to a series of decisions that made him look gullible at best, predatory at worst. How could he explain to the police officer that he'd given $60,000 to a woman he'd met at a massage parlour? How could he describe their relationship without sounding like exactly what he'd tried so hard not to be? Another pathetic old Western man buying affection from a young Thai woman? The officer listened patiently, but seemed more puzzled than sympathetic, taking notes that Robert suspected would lead nowhere. The language barrier was only part of the problem. The officer explained through a combination of broken English and gestures that cases like this were difficult to prosecute. The money had been given voluntarily, transferred by Robert himself using his own banking credentials. Niran had not technically stolen anything. She had simply accepted gifts and financial support that Robert had freely offered. The fact that she had lied about her identity and family situation was morally reprehensible but not necessarily criminal under Thai law. Even if charges could be filed, the officer explained, the money had likely already been moved through multiple accounts and possibly out of the country entirely. The networks that specialised in this type of fraud were sophisticated and well connected, often with protection from corrupt officials who took a percentage of the profits. Robert would be better off, the officer suggested gently, simply accepting his loss and returning to America before he lost anything else. Walking out of the police station, Robert felt more alone than he had since Sarah's death. At least grief was a socially acceptable emotion that attracted sympathy and support. This was different. This was shame mixed with rage, humiliation compounded by the knowledge that his professional training should have protected him from exactly this type of manipulation. How could a 27-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department be so easily fooled by a con artist? The return to their shared apartment was devastating. Niran's belongings were gone, of course, but she'd left behind just enough to maintain the illusion that she'd return. A toothbrush in the bathroom, a few items of clothing in the closet, a coffee mug by the sink with lipstick still on the rim. It was like visiting a museum of his own stupidity, each artifact a reminder of how thoroughly he'd been deceived. But the worst discovery was waiting on the kitchen table. His laptop open to his banking website with a note written in Niran's careful handwriting. "Thank you for helping my family," it read in English that was suddenly less charmingly accented and more coldly precise. "You are a good man with a kind heart. I hope you understand that some people need help more than others. Your American money will do good things for poor Thai people. Please don't be angry, you will be okay." The casual dismissal of his loss, the way she'd reframed theft as charity, made Robert's hands shake with rage. But underneath the anger was something worse. the creeping realization that his humiliation wasn't over yet. Naran knew things about him that she could use. She had photographs from their time together, intimate pictures that Robert had allowed her to take during moments when he'd felt safe and loved. She knew about his police pension, his social security benefits, his address in Chicago. She had access to information that could be used to embarrass or blackmail him long after he returned to America. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoid preparation. Robert changed all his passwords, closed his Thai bank accounts, and called his banks in America to report the fraud and prevent further unauthorized access. He contacted his credit card companies, his investment accounts, even his utility companies back home, making sure that no one else could gain access to his remaining financial resources. But protecting his money was easier than protecting his dignity. Robert realized that Naran had documented their relationship thoroughly, taking pictures and videos that portrayed him in compromising positions or situations that could be misinterpreted by people who didn't understand the full context. She had images of him drunk and vulnerable, recordings of conversations where he'd revealed personal information about his finances and his loneliness, evidence that could be used to paint him as exactly the kind of desperate sex tourist he'd tried so hard not to become. The implicit threat was clear even though it was never stated directly. Naran had left him a way to contact her, a phone number scrawled on the back of the note she'd left. When Robert finally called it, her voice was different. Gone was the sweet, slightly accented English that had charmed him for months. In its place was something harder, more businesslike, though still recognizably her. She wasn't unkind exactly, but she was completely without remorse. She explained that what had happened between them was simply business, that she'd provided him with companionship and intimacy for several months, and that the money he'd given her was payment for services rendered. If he wanted to think of it differently, that was his choice, but he shouldn't expect her to feel guilty for accepting what he'd freely offered. When Robert mentioned going to the American embassy, filing formal complaints, or pursuing the matter through international legal channels, Naran's tone became noticeably cooler. She reminded him that Thailand was her country, that she had friends and connections he couldn't imagine, and that his reputation as a retired police officer could be significantly damaged if certain photographs and recordings became public. She wasn't threatening him exactly, but she was helping him understand the full scope of his situation. The conversation ended with Naran suggesting that Robert simply return to America and move on with his life. He had enough money left to live comfortably, she pointed out, and he'd learned valuable lessons about trust and relationships that would serve him well in the future. She almost sounded like a counselor offering therapeutic advice, helping him reframe his trauma as a growth experience. Hanging up the phone, Robert realized he was completely trapped. He couldn't pursue justice without exposing himself to public humiliation. He couldn't return to Thailand without risking further exploitation. He couldn't even warn other potential victims without admitting to his own shameful naivety. Naran had constructed a perfect crime, one that protected itself through the victim's own embarrassment and the social stigma attached to older men seeking companionship in Southeast Asia. The decision to fight back came not from courage, but from desperation. Robert spent 3 sleepless days in the apartment that had become a monument to his gullibility, alternating between rage and self-pity, before realizing that accepting defeat meant letting Naran win completely. She was counting on his shame to keep him silent, on his fear of exposure to prevent him from taking action. But 27 years as a detective had taught him that the best way to catch a criminal was to think like one, and Robert was beginning to understand exactly how Naran's operation worked. The first step was research. Robert used his remaining time in Thailand to investigate the network that had ensnared him, applying the same methodical approach he'd used to solve cases back in Chicago. He visited other massage parlours, bars, and tourist areas where Western men gathered, posing as a potential mark while actually gathering intelligence about similar operations. What he discovered was both more extensive and more sophisticated than he'd imagined. The scam wasn't limited to individual women working alone. It was an organised network that included massage parlours, apartment landlords, document forgers, and even some legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering. The women were often from poor rural families who'd been recruited with promises of legitimate work, then trained in the psychological techniques needed to manipulate lonely foreign men. Naran wasn't just a criminal, she was a graduate of what amounted to a criminal academy. Robert learned that the network kept detailed files on their targets, sharing information about successful techniques and vulnerable personality types. His own profile likely existed somewhere in their system. Recent widower, financially comfortable, emotionally isolated, unfamiliar with Thai culture. The personal details he'd shared with Naran during their intimate conversations had probably been recorded and analysed, used to refine the psychological profile that made him such an ideal victim. But Robert also discovered something that gave him hope. The network's success depended entirely on their victims' silence. The operation could only function as long as men like him were too embarrassed to report what had happened, too ashamed to warn others, too proud to admit they'd been fooled. The criminal's greatest weapon wasn't sophisticated technology or violent threats, it was social stigma and masculine pride. Armed with this knowledge, Robert began reaching out to other victims. He found them in expat forums online, in the bars where they gathered to drink away their embarrassment, in the apartments where they sat alone trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives. Some had lost more money than Robert, others less, but all shared the same shame and anger that had paralysed him for days after discovering the truth. The stories were remarkably similar. Beautiful women who seemed genuinely interested in older Western men, family emergencies that required financial assistance, gradual escalation of requests until the victim's resources were exhausted. Some men had lost their retirement savings, others had mortgaged their homes, a few had maxed out credit cards and borrowed money from family members to feed what they'd believed was love but was actually just business. Convincing these men to take action was the hardest part. Most wanted to simply return home and pretend Thailand had never happened, to absorb their losses as the price of their foolishness and move on with whatever remained of their lives. The stigma attached to their situation was so powerful that even victims of the same crime couldn't easily support each other, each man convinced that his particular case was somehow more shameful than the others. But Robert persisted, using the investigative skills that had made him successful as a detective. He built a database of victims, documented the patterns he observed, and began mapping the network that had victimized them all. Slowly, a picture emerged of an operation that was extracting millions of dollars annually from vulnerable tourists, money that was funding increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprises throughout Southeast Asia. The breakthrough came when Robert discovered that Naran had made a crucial mistake. In her eagerness to maximize her profits from their relationship, she'd opened a business account using forged documents that contained small but significant errors. Thai banking regulations required extensive documentation for business accounts, and the forgeries weren't quite perfect enough to withstand scrutiny from someone who knew what to look for. Working with a sympathetic official at the Thai Ministry of Finance, someone who'd been educated in America and understood the scope of the problem, Robert was able to trace several of the money transfers back to accounts that were still active. The amounts were smaller than what he'd lost, but they represented ongoing activity that could be documented and prosecuted if the case could be built properly. The challenge was building a case that Thai authorities would actually pursue. Robert knew that corruption was a factor in the system, that some officials were likely receiving payments to look the other way when crimes like this were reported. But he also knew that Thailand's reputation as a tourist destination was valuable enough that the government would take action if the evidence was compelling and the political pressure was sufficient. Robert began reaching out to American embassy officials, local media contacts, and international law enforcement agencies that specialized in financial crimes. He documented everything meticulously: bank records, photographs, recorded conversations, testimonies from other victims. Slowly, he was building the kind of case that could survive legal challenges and political interference. The turning point came when Robert realized he had one advantage that Naran had never anticipated. He genuinely didn't care about his reputation anymore. The shame that was supposed to keep him silent had burned itself out, replaced by a cold determination to prevent other men from experiencing what he'd endured. If exposing Naran meant admitting his own foolishness publicly, so be it. His pride was a small price to pay for justice. Robert's decision to go public, to contact journalists and documentarians who specialised in international crime stories, was the move that finally got Naran's attention. When she called him again, her voice carried none of the casual confidence from their previous conversation. For the first time since he'd discovered the truth, Robert sensed that he might have found something resembling leverage in their completely unbalanced relationship. The confrontation came sooner than Robert had expected. 3 days after his first interview with a documentary filmmaker working on a piece about romance scams in Southeast Asia, Naran appeared at his apartment door. She looked exactly as beautiful as she had during their time together, but Robert found himself completely immune to the charm that had once devastated his judgment. Seeing her now was like looking at a photograph of someone he'd once known, rather than encountering a person who'd shared his bed and his dreams. She was angry, which surprised him. During their months together, Robert had never seen Naran display genuine emotion beyond carefully calibrated vulnerability and practiced affection. But the woman standing in his doorway was furious in a way that seemed completely authentic, her composure cracked by something that looked like real fear. The interviews Robert had given were going to be broadcast on international television, she informed him, and several other victims had come forward with stories that corroborated his account. The Thai police, embarrassed by the negative publicity, were being pressured to take action against networks like hers. What had started as his personal quest for justice was threatening to become a major law enforcement operation that could destroy everything she'd worked to build. For the first time since learning the truth about their relationship, Robert felt like he was talking to a real person rather than a performer. Naran's accent became thicker when she was angry, her English less polished, and he caught glimpses of the woman she might have been before she learned to weaponize her beauty and charm. She was younger than he'd thought, probably barely 30, and there was something desperate in her eyes that made him wonder what circumstances had led her into this kind of work. But sympathy wasn't the same as forgiveness, and Robert had learned not to trust his emotional responses to this woman. When Naran offered to return some of the money in exchange for his silence, Robert realised that he'd gained something more valuable than financial compensation: power. For the first time in their relationship, he was the one with leverage. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Robert had experienced in his law enforcement career. Naran wasn't just trying to buy his silence. She was trying to save herself from consequences that went far beyond anything Robert had imagined. The network she worked for didn't tolerate members who attracted law enforcement attention, she explained. If the documentary aired and led to arrests, she would be held responsible for bringing unwanted scrutiny to the operation. As they talked, Robert began to understand that Naran was as trapped in the criminal network as he'd been trapped in her emotional manipulation. She'd started working massage parlours to support her family, she claimed, but had been recruited into the romance scam operation by people who offered her more money than she'd ever imagined. Once she'd proven successful at it, leaving became impossible. The organisation knew too much about her, controlled too many aspects of her life, and had too much invested in her continued productivity to simply let her walk away. Robert found himself in the strange position of feeling sympathy for the person who'd destroyed his financial security and emotional well-being. But he'd learned not to trust his instincts about Naran, and he suspected that even her vulnerability might be calculated to manipulate him into protecting her. Whether her current distress was genuine or performed, the consequences of his actions were real, and Robert had to decide how far he was willing to go in his pursuit of justice. The decision was made easier by the arrival of 2 Thai police officers who'd been monitoring Robert's apartment. The law enforcement investigation that his media interviews had triggered was more extensive than he'd realised, involving cooperation between Thai authorities, American law enforcement, and international agencies that specialised in financial crimes. Robert's case had provided the evidence needed to justify a major operation against the entire network. Watching Naran being arrested was more complicated emotionally than Robert had anticipated. Despite everything she'd done to him, despite the cold calculation with which she'd exploited his loneliness and grief, he felt a pang of something that might have been regret as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The woman being led away was both the person he'd fallen in love with and a complete stranger, a paradox that his mind struggled to resolve. The investigation that followed was extensive and international in scope. Robert testified to Thai prosecutors, American FBI agents, and documentary filmmakers, telling his story repeatedly until it began to feel like something that had happened to someone else. The details of the romance scam network that emerged during the investigation were staggering. Hundreds of victims, millions of dollars in losses, connections to human trafficking and drug smuggling operations throughout Southeast Asia. Robert learned that his case had been particularly valuable to investigators because of his law enforcement background. His methodical approach to documenting the crime, his ability to preserve evidence and identify patterns, and his willingness to cooperate fully with authorities had provided the foundation for prosecutions that would have been impossible otherwise. The shame that had nearly kept him silent had been transformed into something resembling pride in his contribution to justice. The money recovery process was slow and incomplete. Some of Robert's losses were recovered from frozen accounts, but much of what he'd lost had already been moved beyond the reach of law enforcement. He received enough back to stabilise his financial situation, but not enough to undo the damage completely. The financial consequences of his time with Naran would affect his retirement for years to come, a permanent reminder of the price of misplaced trust. but the emotional recovery was more complete than Robert had dared to hope. The process of fighting back, of transforming himself from victim to advocate, had restored something that Naran's deception had taken from him, his sense of agency and self-respect. He was no longer the pathetic old man who'd been fooled by a pretty face. He was someone who'd made mistakes but had found the courage to confront them, to take responsibility for his choices while also demanding accountability from those who'd exploited his vulnerabilities. Robert's flight back to Chicago 6 months later was nothing like the departure that had brought him to Thailand. The man who'd fled to Southeast Asia carrying nothing but grief and desperate hope was returning with something more valuable than the money he'd lost, a clear understanding of who he was and what he wanted from whatever years remained to him. The empty house in suburban Chicago looked different when he walked through the door for the first time since Sarah's death had driven him away. The photographs of their life together no longer felt like accusations or reminders of what he'd lost. Instead, they looked like evidence of what he'd been capable of. Real love, genuine partnership, the kind of authentic connection that no amount of money could buy or replace. The neighbourhood seemed smaller than he remembered, the familiar streets and houses looking like a movie set from a life he'd outgrown. But Robert no longer felt trapped by the memories contained in these rooms. His experiences in Thailand, devastating as they'd been, had broken the spell that grief had cast over his life. He was no longer living in the past or running from it. He was simply present in his own life for the first time in years. The media attention from the documentary about romance scams had brought Robert more recognition than he'd expected or wanted. His story had resonated with viewers around the world, particularly older men who recognised their own vulnerabilities in his experience. The response had been overwhelmingly supportive, with hundreds of letters and emails from people who thanked him for his courage in speaking publicly about such a personal failure. But the most meaningful contacts came from other victims of similar scams, people who'd found the strength to come forward after seeing Robert's willingness to admit his mistakes publicly. Some had lost more money than Robert, others had been victimised in different ways, but all shared the common experience of having their trust exploited by people who specialised in preying on loneliness and hope. Robert found himself becoming an informal advocate for romance scam victims, helping people navigate the complex process of reporting international fraud and connecting them with law enforcement agencies that specialised in these cases. The work was unpaid and often frustrating, but it gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his retirement. He was using his law enforcement experience to help people who were experiencing the same shame and isolation that had nearly destroyed him. The speaking engagements that grew out of the media attention were unexpected but gratifying. Robert found himself addressing groups of seniors about the warning signs of romance scams, talking to law enforcement agencies about the psychological techniques used by international fraud networks, and consulting with financial institutions about protecting vulnerable customers from sophisticated manipulation. The work forced him to revisit his own experience repeatedly, but each telling of the story made it feel less personal and more instructive. What had happened to him in Thailand was no longer just a humiliating mistake, it was a case study in how intelligent, experienced people could be victimised when criminals understood their psychological vulnerabilities better than they understood themselves. The relationship with Naran, Robert realised, had never been about love at all. It had been about his need to feel wanted and valuable again after years of feeling invisible and useless. She had recognised that need and exploited it expertly, giving him just enough genuine-seeming affection to keep him emotionally invested while systematically extracting everything of value from his life. Understanding this didn't make the memory less painful, but it did make it less personal. Robert's new relationships, when they eventually developed, were built on completely different foundations. He dated women his own age who had their own lives and resources, people who were interested in companionship rather than rescue or financial support. The conversations were different, less dramatic but more honest, based on shared experiences rather than projected fantasies about saving or being saved. The financial recovery took years longer than the emotional healing. Robert had to adjust his retirement lifestyle significantly, moving to a smaller house and reducing his travel plans to accommodate the money he'd lost. But the constraints felt less like punishment than like clarity about what actually mattered. He discovered that he needed far less money to be happy than he'd imagined, and that the security he'd spent his career building was less important than the connections he'd neglected while pursuing it. The annual trips to Thailand that Robert began taking 3 years after his return to Chicago were motivated by work rather than pleasure. He consulted with law enforcement agencies there, testified in ongoing prosecutions of romance scam networks, and spoke to groups about protecting tourist communities from similar operations. The country that had been the site of his greatest humiliation became a place where he could contribute meaningfully to solving problems that affected thousands of vulnerable people. During one of these trips, Robert learned that Naran had been sentenced to several years in prison for her role in the fraud network. He felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy at the news, just a kind of abstract recognition that justice had followed its course. The woman who had seemed so important to his life for those few months in Pattaya had become simply another criminal whose case had been resolved by the legal system. The most important lesson Robert learned wasn't about romance scams or international fraud, though those were certainly part of his education. It was about the difference between loneliness and solitude, between needing someone and wanting someone, between running from grief and moving through it. His time with Naran had felt like healing, but it had actually been just another form of avoidance, a way of postponing the real work of rebuilding his life after loss. Real healing, Robert discovered, came from accepting responsibility for his choices while also forgiving himself for being human enough to make them. It came from using his experience to help others rather than hiding from it in shame. It came from building a life based on his actual values and interests rather than on his fears about growing old alone. The final letter Robert wrote to Naran, which he never sent but which helped him process his feelings, began with forgiveness and ended with gratitude. Forgiveness for the lies and manipulation, but also for the unintended gift she'd given him, the opportunity to discover that he was stronger and more resilient than he'd believed. Her betrayal had been devastating, but his recovery had been transformative in ways that a conventional relationship might never have achieved. Today, at 58, Robert's life looks nothing like what he'd planned during those long months of grief after Sarah's death. But it's a life he's chosen consciously rather than one he's fallen into by accident or desperation. He has work that matters, relationships based on honesty rather than need, and a clear understanding of what he will and won't accept from other people and from himself. If you're watching this story and recognizing something in your own life or the life of someone you care about, don't let shame keep you silent. Reach out for help. Report the crime. Share your story with people who can learn from it. Your experience, no matter how painful or embarrassing it might feel, could prevent someone else from making the same mistakes. Subscribe to our channel for more real stories about real people who found the courage to turn their worst moments into sources of strength and wisdom. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own experiences. And remember, everyone deserves love and companionship, but no one deserves to be exploited or manipulated in their search for connection. Stay safe out there and keep watching for the stories that remind us all that redemption is possible even after our